Roots of Anti-Humanism. Now, what I'm talking about in this section is not neoliberalism. This is things that influenced it, things that kind of laid the basis for it. So first of all, liberalism. You know, when people talk about neoliberalism, I think a lot of people use it, you know, there's liberals that are Democrats, there's conservatives that are Republicans, there's neoconservatives, neoliberals. That's not the correct use of the term. Neoliberalism is an economic term. And it goes back to the roots of what liberalism actually meant when it originated as a word, which is the time that feudalism was being toppled and the new system of capitalism was coming in. A new philosophy and a new understanding of the world rooted in the Enlightenment emerged, and it was about emphasizing the individual. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the rights of man, life, liberty, and property, John Locke, individualism, human rights. This was the philosophy that emerged, and this is really the philosophy that now dominates the world, is liberalism. You can call it liberalism, the belief in the individual. And economic liberalism is the belief in free markets, or in the belief in capitalism. Social liberalism is the belief that people have the right to live their own life the way they want to and not be messed with by the government. So it's very different than the kind of the standard way we use it now, which is Democrats are liberals, Republicans are conservatives. In the sense of neoliberalism, economic liberalism refers to free markets. That's what liberalism and neoliberalism means. So, you know, you have Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations, and he talks about free trade and how you have the invisible hand that supply and demand, you know, just basic economics, you know, modern capitalist thinking emerges. Then later you have an English philosopher, and he emerges, he's more of an economist, Robert Thomas Malthus. And Malthus comes up with this theory that he argues that essentially that the population grows faster than the food supply, and he argues that that's why the French Revolution happened. Right? Is that the food supply had grown, had not grown. The population was growing. There were too many people, and this caused the French Revolution, and that all the unrest that was taking place in Europe around that time. And this was a time of great turmoil. You know, the old feudal monarchies were being overturned. People were rising up and creating modern nation states. He argues that this is all because of a term he coined called overpopulation, right? There's just too many people in the world, the food supply is down. And so then you have Charles Darwin, the famous biologist, who was actually a follower of Malthus. And his biological theories are largely correct and widely appreciated and celebrated in the world today. But people look at Charles Darwin's work and they see that in some ways, even modern biologists are critical of it because he's arguing for natural selection, right? That responding to their environments, life gradually changes over time. But if you read like his book, for example, The Descent of Man, he talks about human beings as if they are kind of the pinnacle of evolution. Like all of the history of life is just gradually escalating to get to human beings. And so immediately you have people who take Charles Darwin's ideas, people that you could call social Darwinists, and they really cling to the phrase survival of the fittest. And they start arguing that, for example, the British Empire, it was right for them to conquer the world because they're the fittest, they're the most powerful, and it's right for them to exterminate other people, and their actions, free markets and capitalism are great because the fittest and the best survive and the others don't. And so that was kind of laying the basis. Now, John D. Rockefeller, who's the founder of Standard Oil and is actually the richest American of all time, he was part of a society that were called Neo-Malthusians. And they were looking, and in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, you have the rise of socialism and Marxism, you have strikes and protests that are taking place. And John D. Rockefeller and the Neo-Malthusians, they argue that, again, the problem is there's just too many people in the world. There's too many people in the world, there's all these desperately poor people out there, and that's why they're protesting and demanding their rights and food, and we need to do something about overpopulation. So then there's the famous incident, the Ludlow Massacre, 1914. And so essentially this is in Colorado. There's a group of miners, and they're on strike demanding better wages, and they live in homes that are owned by the company, right? And they don't get paid in money, they get paid in script that's only usable at the company store, right? And they're in awful conditions. They go on strike, and so they're immediately kicked out of their homes. And so they set up an encampment someplace, as they're kicked out of their homes. John D. Rockefeller sends company guards and the National Guard. They open fire with machine guns into this tent city and just slaughter all these people. It's a horrendous incident. 20 people are killed, many more injured, children. Just a horrendous incident. So then, interestingly, that brings you to Margaret Sanger. Now, Margaret Sanger was a socialist, a Marxist revolutionary living here in New York City. And she, she really believed in birth control and women's reproductive rights. That was the issue that she very, very strongly believed in. But she was a socialist and a Marxist. She was actually on the committee of the Socialist Party of New York City. She was a funder financially of the industrial workers of the world. And she heard about John D. Rockefeller's horrendous blood law massacre, and she then printed in her newspaper, The Rebel Woman, a call for someone to assassinate John D. Rockefeller. And she was also sending birth control through the mail, which at that point was illegal, and she was facing criminal charges. So she fled from the United States because she was facing all these criminal charges. And she was in Britain, and in Britain she started associating with the Neo-Malthusians. And the Neo-Malthusians were arguing that there's too many people in the world, and they thought what she was doing with trying to get birth control legalized was a very, very good thing. Because they said, look, there's too many people in the world, and even though she was a Marxist, and gradually she started to move away from Marxism, and she didn't particularly care for the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union came into existence, at the beginning the Soviet Union had been very socially liberal and, had been talking about free love and such, but as the Soviet Union became more socially conservative and was promoting what they called the Soviet family and, had a traditional gender roles and all of that, she didn't particularly care for the Soviet Union. But she did come back to the United States, and then she set up what was the first birth control clinic in the United States. It was in Brownsville in Brooklyn. And actually John D. Rockefeller, who she had called for killing in her newspaper and fled the United States, ended up paying for it. And that was the first birth control clinic. And then she started writing, and as she wrote about birth control, for example, she began to write about the cruelty of charity. And she began to argue that feeding low-income people was a problem because then they'll have more children, and there's too many of them. And she also began openly and blatantly preaching racism. She spoke at Ku Klux Klan meetings. And actually on the next page, this is a direct quote from one of her writings. She says, birth control is not just contraception indiscriminately and thoughtlessly practiced. It is a means to release the cultivation of better racial elements in our society, and gradually the suppression, elimination, and eventual extirpation of the defective stocks, those human weeds which threaten the blooming and finest flowers of American civilization. So she's basically arguing for eugenics, that we're going to wipe out races we deem to be inferior. Now, I think it's pretty clear that Margaret Sanger believed in birth control because she believed in women's rights. However, she made an alliance with people who believed in birth control for very, very different reasons than she did. So that brings me, of course, to Adolf Hitler. Now, Adolf Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party in Germany, and the main argument of the Nazi Party was they argued that all these protests and uprisings and strikes that were happening during the Great Depression, they were all caused by a genetic defect in Jews. That was the basis of their anti-Semitism. There is this genetic defect in Jews, that they're always causing problems and leading that. And that was the basis for their eventual, horrendous, slaughter of 17 million people, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and others, in gas chambers. Was this belief that they were going to end the uprisings and protests and restore some kind of ancient, glorious ancient civilization by exterminating people en masse. And this poster that I think is very important, this is a poster from Nazi Germany, because the first people that they began exterminating were the disabled. And if you read this poster, it has the picture of a man who's disabled, and it said, this person is suffering from hereditary defects, cost the community this certain amount of money, fellow German, this is your money too. And basically arguing that the disabled community needed to be exterminated because they were costing too much. They were an expense on society, why should we feed them? And the term that was used was useless eater. And that was the term that they used for people they deemed to be, not good for society. Why are we feeding the useless eaters? We ought to just exterminate them. And that was a big point in Nazism. However, after the Second World War, you had what you could call the Keynesian consensus. At that point, there was a feeling that in the lead up to the Second World War, we'd have the Great Depression. People were starving and hungry, massive strikes and protests, mass unemployment and hunger. And there was, John Maynard Keynes, the British economist. His philosophy was basically that the government should take action to make the economy work better. That instead of saying what Marxists said the problem is overproduction, he said the issue was underconsumption, right? That people just, with their wages being low, they don't have the ability to spend. So people illustrate Keynesian economics by saying, okay, so say the government hires somebody to go out and dig a hole in the ground and then fill it back in. Somebody might look at that and say that's a waste of money. But that guy who's getting paid a wage to dig the hole, and then fill it back in, he then has spending money, and he goes and spends that money, and that builds the economy, right? And there was a feeling that the government should spend money to stimulate the economy, and that's the basis of Keynesian economics. And John Maynard Keynes was very much, I mean, he was not a Marxist whatsoever. He was very much a believer in capitalism and all that, but he believed that the state, you know, should intervene to try and stimulate the economy. And this is all kind of the background, these ideas that lay the basis for what we'll get into in the next section, which is the ideology and the emergence of neoliberalism. So that's section 1. So let's have some